Not the kind you catch in the corner of your eye and dismiss, but one that lingers, watching, waiting. That eerie, gut-churning sensation of being observed crept into my life like an uninvited guest, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. I'm a junior in high school, living in a decent town. It's not a fancy private school kind of place, but it's good enough. My neighborhood, the kind people call up and coming, a polite way of saying it's okay but not perfect. I walk or bike everywhere since I don't have a car. I see a lot of people this way, and usually it's no big deal. Then, there was him. The first time I saw the man my friends and I would later dub the crackhead, I was heading to the park for some basketball. He passed by, muttering something incomprehensible. I ignored him. He was just another stranger on the street, or so I thought. One evening, my girlfriend and I were curled up on the couch, watching a movie. The cozy atmosphere shattered when a chill ran down my spine. Turning instinctively toward the windows behind the couch, I saw a figure standing there, peering through the blinds. The man's build and clothes looked familiar. My girlfriend turned to look, but by then he was gone, walking away as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. A creepy one, sure, but nothing more. Until it wasn't. One day I was walking to the store with my best friend, P. The crackhead appeared again, approaching us with a friendly hello. We greeted him back and kept moving, but P's mood shifted. After a long pause, he turned to me, his voice low and uneasy. "You know he said your name, right? Did you tell him your name? I hadn't." My stomach sank. Then came the night that solidified my fear. P and another friend, K, were hanging out at my house. We decided to hit the park for a late-night basketball game. As we walked, we spotted him again, standing silently in the shadows. His eyes locked onto us, following our every move. We quickened our pace. He did too. Eventually he stopped, but the damage was done. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The final straw came early one morning. Unable to sleep, I went for a run at 5 a.m. Wrestling season demanded I stay fit, and I figured the crisp air might clear my head. As I rounded the corner onto my street, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, standing across from the entrance, staring at me. His eyes followed my every step. I turned onto my street, glancing back over my shoulder. He was gone. Vanished. By the time I got home, the sun was up, and I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. But was it? Things only got darker. A few years later, when I was living alone in a small apartment, strange things began happening. Little things at first. Less food in the fridge than I remembered, cushions from the couch on the floor, misplaced items. It was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't explain away. Until one night. I woke up drenched in sweat, the air heavy with a suffocating silence. It was around 1 a.m., and I couldn't remember having a nightmare. I decided to take a shower to shake off the unease. As the steam filled the bathroom, I heard the faint creak of the door. My stomach twisted. I always left it slightly open, but it didn't move on its own. Grabbing my phone from the counter, I caught a reflection in the screen. Someone was standing on the other side of the shower curtain. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. Slowly, I adjusted the water to its hottest setting. The pipes groaned as steam thickened around me. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, I spun around, ripped the curtain open, and aimed the scalding water at the intruder. It was a woman. She screamed as the water hit her, and in the chaos, I grabbed the shower head and struck her across the face. Bolting from the bathroom, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. Her fists pounded against the door as I called the police, but my fear turned to horror when I reached for a knife in the kitchen, only to find it missing. When the police arrived, they arrested her. The story they pieced together was chilling. She used to live in the apartment, but had been evicted for not paying rent. She'd made a copy of the key and had been sneaking in while I was at work, or worse, while I slept. To this day, I wonder if she was the reason I woke up that night. I've stopped trying to convince myself otherwise. Now, whenever I move, the locks are the first thing I change. Some shadows don't just pass by, they stay. And sometimes they know your name. It started with an angry growl, low and menacing, slicing through the stillness of the night. At first I thought it was just my dog, probably caught sight of a stray cat wandering too close to the house. But that night was different. The sound wasn't coming from the front window where he usually stood guard. No, this time, it was coming from the locked basement door. I'll get back to that night, but let me start at the beginning. When we first moved into that 3-story house, it felt like a dream come true. It was nestled on a quiet hill, the kind of neighborhood where people didn't bother locking their doors. My parents, my younger sibling, and our ever-watchful dog called it home for years. From the front, it looked like a modest 2-story house, but the basement opened out into the backyard, a backyard so spacious and quiet it felt like it belonged to another world. That's where we first met Lucas, the boy from across the street. At first glance, he seemed like any other neighborhood kid, quiet, a little awkward, but harmless enough. It wasn't until much later that we realized there was something off about him. His behavior was unsettling, the kind that left a knot in your stomach without you knowing why. And now, thinking back, I'm almost certain Lucas had been inside our house. Our family wasn't great at keeping track of the basement doors. With all the comings and goings, letting the dog out, us kids running in and out to play, they'd often be left unlocked. Sure, my parents made it a nightly ritual to double-check the locks, but this was a neighborhood where everyone felt safe. No one worried about what might be lurking after dark. Until the growling started. It was around 2:30 a.m., and as usual, I was still awake in my upstairs bedroom. I had a messed up sleep schedule back then, spending hours scrolling or playing games, long after everyone else had gone to bed. That night, the growl pulled me out of my late-night haze. It wasn't a bark, it was low, guttural, primal. I rushed downstairs, expecting to find my dog by the front window, fixated on some animal outside. Instead, I found him at the basement door. His body was rigid, the fur along his back standing on end. His nose was pressed against the small gap at the bottom, as if he were trying to sniff out whatever was on the other side. My heart pounded. The door was locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. "Mom, Dad," I whispered urgently, shaking them awake. My dad groaned, waving it off as our dog reacting to noises outside. Eventually he got up to check, grumbling the whole way. When he came back, he looked tired but unconcerned. "Forgot to lock one of the basement doors," he said casually, as though that explained everything. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. A few weeks later, something even more terrifying happened. It was another late night, and I was in my room again when a sudden deafening bark echoed through the house. It startled me so badly I almost fell out of my chair. My dog rarely barked like that unless something was seriously wrong. I sprang up and glanced out my bedroom window, expecting to see an animal in the yard. Instead, I froze. There, running across our yard in the dark, was Lucas. His movements were quick and jerky, like he was trying to escape without being seen. He darted across the street and disappeared into his house. I stood there in stunned silence, my breath fogging the window. What was he doing in our yard at that hour? I yanked the curtains closed and sat down, shaking. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next morning, I told my mom everything. She promised to speak to Lucas's parents, but when she did, their response was maddening. Lucas? Oh no, he'd never do something like that. Their denial was firm, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining things. Years later, when I look back on those nights, I can't help but wonder how far it went. Did Lucas ever make it past the basement door? Did he walk through our home while we slept, touching our things, standing over us? We don't live in that house anymore, and I've grown older, but the memories linger like a shadow in the back of my mind. And sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I think I hear it again, that growl, that bark, and I wonder, was it ever just Lucas? Or was there something worse hiding in the dark? It started on a cold winter night. One of those nights when the world seems quieter than usual, like it's holding its breath. My little house in Northern California was nestled just outside the suburbs, surrounded by a perfect blend of solitude and distant neighbors. The darkness there had always felt comforting, until that night. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights of my car cut through the heavy cloud cover, illuminating only the porch and a sliver of the yard. The air was sharp, and as I stepped out of the car, a strange, acrid smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. My heart sank. I had never noticed that smell here before. Scanning the shadows, I saw no one, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Brushing it off, I locked the door behind me and settled in for the evening. Exhausted from a long shift, I decided to take a quick shower and head to bed. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the water heater. By 7 p.m., I was under the covers, ready to surrender to sleep. But sleep didn't last. I woke suddenly, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something. A noise from downstairs. My first thought was my friend. He sometimes stopped by after work to use my shower, and I'd given him a spare key, but he always texted me first, and tonight there'd been no text. Reaching for my phone, the screen's blinding glow pierced the darkness, and I squinted to check the time. 9:12 p.m., no missed messages. My voice trembled as I called out his name. Silence. And then, footsteps. Loud, deliberate footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor below. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was inside my house. The footsteps quickened, heavy and frantic, moving toward the stairs. I sprang out of bed and darted to the closet. The intruder was already halfway up the stairs as I fumbled with the attic access. Adrenaline surged through me as I pulled myself up, barely managing to lift my feet inside before my bedroom door burst open. I froze. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the eerie creak of my closet door swinging open. Peering through the cracks in the attic floorboards, I could see him, just from the knees down. Dirty blue jeans, frayed cuffs, and worn work boots. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breathing heavy, the tension unbearable. Then a crash. The sound of my bed being flipped over shook the house. I bit down hard on my lip, trying to stay silent. He let out a guttural scream, full of frustration, before storming out of the room. I stayed curled in the attic, counting slowly, 1 second at a time. When I reached 1,000, I finally climbed down. My room was a disaster, my bed overturned, my belongings scattered everywhere. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I grabbed the landline and called the police. The first floor was in shambles. Chairs were knocked over, cupboards emptied, and shelves upended. The only thing missing was a knife from the wooden block in the kitchen. The police found evidence that the side door had been pried open with a crowbar. And then it hit me. He'd been outside when I got home, smoking in the shadows, watching me. They advised me to stay elsewhere, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. That night, I blocked the broken door with a heavy shelf and stayed awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The next day, I had the door repaired and installed motion lights around the house. I even ran a phone line to the attic, unwilling to ever be stranded up there without a way to call for help. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd been slower, if he hadn't gone into the bathroom first, or if I hadn't made it to the attic in time. The darkness that once felt cozy now feels like it's always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. That night changed everything, and I still don't know if he's out there, somewhere, waiting for another chance.